Hello. So for this video for Black History Month, we're going to talk about the Sistren Theatre Collective's play QPH. So I really think this is quite an awesome play. I think Sistren Theatre Collective is a super interesting theater group. I don't remember whether I properly created it, but I did a lot of the initial early stage building of the Wikipedia page for Sistren Theatre Collective because they just are really interesting. So they are a grassroots, community-driven theater company founded in Kingston, Jamaica in 1977. And it was a very sort of informal initial grouping built through a government program to sort of build awareness of issues and to try and strengthen employment rates by teaching people, workers, the homeless, the unemployed, etc., new skills, etc. And the Sistren Theatre Collective was formed out of that impulse. And what they basically did was they started creating devised theater that responded to and analyzed socio-cultural, political, economic situations in Jamaica, particularly those facing women, but also larger issues facing women in general, beyond just Jamaica, facing Jamaica as a whole, without the sort of gender boundary, facing post-colonial societies, etc., right? So this is essentially what they do. Now, I'm reading QPH out of Helen Gilbert's Post-Colonial Plays, an anthology, which is an excellent collection. I highly recommend it. So some of the, I do want to sort of go through some of the things that Gilbert says in the introduction about Sistren Theatre Collective's technique. So it says here they use improvisation based on real life stories by and about Jamaican women. Almost all of the members were working class and most were single mothers, and their primary mission became to examine the ways in which women in their society are oppressed, particularly by men, but also by the broader structures that shape Jamaican culture. So they're very much an engaged, socially oriented group. But their process is very much, it's almost sort of inflected by Augusto Boal's Theatre of the Oppressed, but it's not quite the same thing in that I don't think the collective sort of was like, we have read Boal, let us put his principles into action. I think this was more a sort of organic, which Boal would probably love. I imagine Boal would be like, fuck yes, create the structures that I am theorizing about organically. That is the best way of doing it. Because in Theatre of the Oppressed, what Boal talks about, there's a lot of parts to it, but the sort of broadest brushstrokes are basically that theater should be made by and within communities to speak to the problems within those communities, and it should do so in a way that is both responsible to and responsive to audiences. That is, audiences should be engaged with that theater. Audiences, like the theater should create scenarios in which the problems facing the community are dramatized, with the audience invited to respond, to weigh in, to question, to propose solutions, to talk about actual community issues, as opposed to just sort of within the strictures of the theater. And the collective isn't, I think, quite that sort of audience participatory, but they definitely draw on devised theater. So they sort of develop the kernel of an idea through internal discussions, dialogue, whatever it is. Then they start sort of gathering input and interviewing people in the community who are impacted by these issues, doing some research, etc., etc. They devise scenarios and they build their plays from that. So even though the theater ends up being scripted, the process of creation itself is very community-oriented and community-engaged, which is a big deal because they are trying to make an actual difference in the community, right? It's not agitprop theater as such, which is a style that developed really during the Great Depression and then sort of carried on into the social justice movement, the civil rights movement, women's rights movement, anti-apartheid, anti-Vietnam, etc., in the latter part of the 20th century. And agitprop is meant to fire people up and get people really sort of rah, let's go put the rich's heads on a spike. Which, I mean, pretty based, but, it's meant to sort of rile people up short term. And what Sistren Theatre Collective tries to do is more to sort of explore these issues with the aim of long-term growth, right? And there's something, I would say, Brechtian in that objective. And there's a Brechtian element to QPH in that it draws very heavily on an Itu ritual, which is a ritual brought from West African cultures to the diasporic communities of the Caribbean, particularly, but also places in what is now the United States, probably South America, places like this, right? And so it's a ritual for commemorating, honoring, sending off properly the dead. And so that ritual component where the action of the play, which is sort of retrospective, looking back at the experiences, for the most part, for the first 3/4, 2/3, somewhere in there, is retrospective, looking back at the experience of the primary three characters, Queenie, Pearlie, and Hopi, the QPH of the title. And it actually sort of, ironically enough, perhaps inverses or reverses the order of that to tell Hopi's story, then Pearlie's story, then Queenie's story. But these sort of flashback stories of their prior experiences are broken up and bookended by the Itu ritual. And it is sort of performed with drumming, with chanting, with ritual dancing, etc., etc. All of the stuff that you want for a good ritual, right? And so there is, again, that sort of Brechtian element there where it is clear that we are not watching something naturalistic. We are watching something that has been artistically constructed in specific ways in order to raise our social consciousness. But again, I don't know that the Sistren Theatre Collective sort of read Brecht and said, aha, we have a methodology. I think they developed this. And I mean, people like Brecht and Boal were sort of in the zeitgeist. And definitely the Sistren Theatre Collective worked with people who were very, very accomplished theater makers and very familiar with theater theory, et cetera, et cetera. And so those people definitely would have known this and brought this to the collective. But I also think there's a big sort of grassroots organic element to this, where they develop their own methodologies, their own approaches, their own ways of devising performance that make sense and are rooted in their particular communal context, right? So anyway, QPH. Again, I really, really like this play. I think it's really, really interesting. As I said, it follows these three main characters. So Hopi, so these three characters have all experienced this horrific fire in the Kingston almshouse. Yeah, it's just called the Kingston Almshouse. I said that, and then I was like, that doesn't sound exactly like the right name, but it is anyway. So they're all so in the last portion of the play, they're all they've all been through this fire. Queenie is the only one of the three who has survived. A number of other denizens of this almshouse have survived as well, but Hopi and Pearlie have both died in the fire. And so the last portion is framed as a government inquiry into the causes of this fire, where all of these poor people, older people, people with disabilities, etc., had been living. And the bulk of the story, the bulk of the play, is these sort of biographical snippets of the three characters that explore how they got to be in this predicament where they were in this almshouse and experienced this devastating fire. So Hopi had been born in rural Jamaica, and she was brought to Kingston by her aunt, or her aunt if you're a Rochesterian like me, but I suspect in Jamaica people say aunt, and I don't know why I defaulted to that. But she's been brought to Kingston, to the city, the big city, as it were, by her aunt, who, and her cousins to a lesser extent. Her cousins are kids, so they didn't have that much to do with it. But basically, they use her as an unpaid domestic servant. Or her pay is that she gets a place to live and some food to eat. But she continually has to work. She does not have access to education. She does not have a social life. She does reflect several times that there were men who seemed interested in maybe marrying her, and her aunt was like, no, get out of here. You can't. That's my niece/slave. And it really is kind of an enslavement scenario, right? She has no access to basically anything that could help her establish herself independently of her aunt and her cousins. And when several years down the line, or decades down the line, when her aunt dies, the cousins decide to sell the house, and they're like, well, yeah, you're our cousin and you've served us for decades with no pay. Hope it works out for you. So basically she gets kicked out onto the streets by her family. Pearlie actually comes from quite a different background. She was from quite a wealthy family, and we meet her with her mother preparing her for, it seems like sort of an engagement party, something like this, because she's going to be marrying this dude who's all fucking rich and shit. And Pearlie's like, so here's a funny story. I am pregnant with the gardener's child. Now, it's not entirely clear to me from the play whether or not this was a consensual relationship or whether or not something problematic happened with the gardener. Pearlie's mother does not care one way or the other. She throws her daughter out of the house, and Pearlie essentially becomes an alcoholic and a sex worker who's subject to violence and sexual violence, physical violence, theft, etc., in part because of her reliance on alcohol to cope with her situation. And then we have Queenie. Queenie is probably the strongest of the three. She had wanted to be basically a preacher in the, I think, Pentecostal church. And she seemed to do quite a good job, right? We see one sermon of hers, or one service that she leads, and she seems to do quite a good job. But the people of the congregation, really the women of the congregation, then come to her and are like, listen, we don't really believe in women preachers. We don't think it's a good thing. We don't want you to be our preacher. Also, we believe that you have had an illicit relationship with our regular male preacher who has not been around for a while, and we don't like that. So get out. And because they spread these rumors about her, Queenie is unable to find another position where she could be a religious leader, minister, priest, whatever it is, right? And so she ends up basically sort of selling small trinkets and baked goods and whatnot along the side of the road and basically struggling to survive. And then the government decides to demolish the place where she is living and is basically like, hope it works out for you. So she ends up basically going to this almshouse, and they all end up in this almshouse. And in this almshouse, there's squalor, there's suffering, there's poverty. It's generally a bad place to be. These young guys show up at the fence, and they're basically like taunting them and threatening to kill them, to steal their stuff, to sexually assault them. And I mean, to their credit, these old women are like, fuck you guys, you shut up, get out of here, you're just trash, right? So they're holding their own. But realistically, if these dudes were to try and actually break in, there's probably very little that these women could actually do to stop them. So there's that element of it. But the place subsequently burns down. And again, the last portion, Act 2, Scene 3, which is the last scene, is basically 3 monologues with slight interjections from a voice off stage who just says next between each one. So there's Begga, Eva, and Queenie. Begga and Eva, or Ava, probably Eva since it's EVA, they sort of tell their version of the stories, which basically boils down to, I don't know how the fire started, but I'm going to sort of reiterate some of my character traits. But Queenie gives a really interesting speech, and this is the call to action. This is a standard technique, I think, for Sistren Theatre Collective. There's a call to action. Now that you have seen this play, that these events have been dramatized, go out and make social change. And so I'm going to read you all of Queenie's speech. It's a bit lengthy. It is in patois. I'm going to do my best to not both say things correctly and to not be offensive. But I, as a non-patois speaker, this is a slightly weird thing, because one of the things that Sistren Theatre Collective is dedicated to is working in patois so that their audience in Jamaica can understand it, and so that it is theater that speaks to them in their own vernacular. But it's not my vernacular, so there's slightly, I am not the target audience for this, so there's a little bit of that sort of like disconnect there, but I'm going to do it nonetheless. So this is Queenie. How do you do, sir? Me name Elizabeth McQueen. Dem call me Queenie. Was a terrible sight, sir. De fire, de smoke, de flame, de bawlin'. I did almost turn fool, sir, but me never panic too much. Only when me couldn't reach me two friend. Dem building shoulda condemned long time, so old board. Is a lucky ting to fire never down way to deformed pickney dem day. Some of dem can't even open dem mouth, much less fi bawl for help. Special hospital school should build for dem. Dem parents dash dem away when dem born wrong shape, but dem is human being and we have a duty for take care of dem. Yes, sir. As me was saying, if you ever see it, how we chuck up, chuck up. About 700 and odd a we in a de whole almshouse, and 200 and whole heap did in a de ward that catch fire. All now them no know how much we get away. Some of them, the nurse them try, but what them can do? Them only have 2 hand, and super 2 good people. Him come look for me when me did in a hospital. Him take little time and bring Milo and milk for me. Me here, sir, dem go build a new almshouse for we in a de hill or bush. We can't, we no want that. We want it for build back right here, no, so, near to where we people can get vehicle fi come visit we, if is only once a year. Dem must build it properly with good gates and guard to check out who a come and go. And ask we what we want. We old, but we no fool. Build decent bathroom and toilet like what Ono have in a Ono house. Make public service wire to place properly and come check it regular. Could even have we own electrician. Whole heap of bad wire in you that can cause fire. Make space for we plant and do little cultivating. We old, but we active and we want occupation. Give we materials and we will make things and sell for help take care of we instead of just having we sitting so. So we have the time and patience for teach the deformed picnic them in ye that them give up on, say them a imbecile. We teach them for talk and do things for themselves and organize little cultural things for we. Sometimes we organize we self and sing and dance. Dem must arrange trips and take we on outings sometimes. No carry we go in no bush or hill where you can see we, so Ono can have a free conscience. We one live. Everybody have to get old, but remember, the old have to key to the future because we have the secrets of the past. So basically, in this speech, Queenie argues for a social system that cares for the elderly by allowing the elderly, to have a decent standard of living with decent housing, electricity, toilet facilities, etc., but also gives them occupation, things that they can do, whether that's cultivating gardens or sort of making things, things that could be sold, whatever it is, or educating the children in the, I guess sort of, probably mental institution is the right comparison, but not like, these mental institutions, right, used to be places where people with learning disabilities or physical deformities were put, basically to keep them out of regular society. So, right, this is a, I don't know, poorhouse, I guess, where children with disabilities have been basically sort of put and forgotten about. And Queenie is saying, listen, we can teach them. Just let us do it, right? Let us do stuff. We can teach them to talk. We can teach them to be members of society. We can teach them skills, whatever it is, right? And so the thing that's really striking about this is, on the one level, it is an assertion of what should be done for this community that has experienced this fire, right? You should build this new almshouse in these ways to meet our needs. But it's also about build this new community, this new almshouse, in such a way that we can contribute to society. That is what we want to do. And if we are allowed to do it because of our knowledge, our background, the secrets of the past, as she puts it in her final phrase, we can be a social asset and we can make the world better, or society or Jamaica better. And it's a very, very strong closing message.